September 11th, 1973. This is the sound of democracy dying. In Santiago, Chile, fighter jets are bombing the presidential palace. Inside, the country's democratically elected leader, Salvador Allende, is about to make his last stand. By the end of the day, Allende will be dead. Chile's long, proud tradition of democracy will be gone, replaced by a brutal military dictatorship. But this wasn't just some simple coup. This was the final act of a secret war waged by the world's most powerful democracy against a smaller one. This is the story of how the West, led by the United States, helped create a monster. One man trusted the wrong general. It destroyed a nation. To understand the explosion of 1973, you have to go back to the spark of 1970. That year, Chile did something remarkable. A physician and veteran socialist politician named Salvador Allende won the presidency. It was a world first. A Marxist leader had been democratically elected in a liberal democracy in Latin America. Allende led the Popular Unity Coalition, a group of left-wing parties with a radical vision for a new Chile. He wasn't promising a violent revolution. His platform was a peaceful, democratic road to socialism, what he called the Chilean path. For millions of poor and working-class Chileans, this was a moment of incredible hope. The new government promised to fight the country's staggering inequality with measures that sounded like a dream. Fair prices for medicine, social security for everyone, and a pint of milk for every child in Chile. The core of his plan was nationalizing key industries, especially the massive copper mines, which were mostly owned by American corporations. For decades, Chile's greatest natural resource had made foreign companies and a tiny local elite rich. Allende famously called copper the wage of Chile, and he planned to use that wage to pay for sweeping social programs in healthcare, education, and land reform. To his supporters, Allende was the face of social justice and national pride. But in the cold, quiet halls of power in Washington, D.C., this democratic experiment wasn't seen as a promise. It was seen as a threat. This was the height of the Cold War. To President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, a democratically elected socialist government was a virus that could infect the entire region and maybe even spread to Europe. The example of a successful, popular socialist democracy in their backyard. It simply couldn't be allowed to happen. The plotting started before Allende even took office. In a now infamous phone call on September 12, 1970, Kissinger told CIA Director Richard Helms exactly where America stood on Chile. "We will not let it go down the drain." 3 days later, President Nixon gave the CIA its direct orders. The instructions, scribbled down by Helms, were blunt. Stop Allende from taking power or get him out. The mission was to make the economy scream. The fuse was lit on a 3-year campaign to tear down Chilean democracy from the outside in. The war against Allende wouldn't be fought with soldiers, at least not at first. It was a quiet, suffocating campaign of economic warfare and political sabotage, all run from thousands of miles away. The CIA's plan was codenamed Project Fubelt, and it had 2 tracks. Track 1 was political. The goal was to bribe and persuade the Chilean Congress to refuse to confirm Allende as president. The CIA funneled cash to opposition politicians and newspapers, running a huge propaganda campaign to paint Allende as a totalitarian monster who would bring ruin. When that didn't work, they switched to track 2. Trigger a military coup. The biggest roadblock was the Chilean military's tradition of staying out of politics. At the top was the army's commander-in-chief, General René Schneider, a man who fiercely believed the military's job was to protect the Constitution, not tear it up. So, Schneider had to go. In October 1970, the CYA gave encouragement and support to a right-wing military faction plotting to get rid of him. On October 22nd, they ambushed his car on his way to work. General Schneider drew his sidearm to defend himself but was shot multiple times. He died 3 days later. The assassination was supposed to spark a military takeover, but it backfired. The public was horrified, and support for a constitutional transition grew, sealing Allende's path to the presidency. But Washington didn't give up. For the next 3 years, the Nixon administration did exactly what he'd ordered. They squeezed the Chilean economy until it screamed. This was the invisible blockade. International credit, which had been flowing into Chile, suddenly evaporated. The Inter-American Development Bank, dominated by the U.S., cut Chile off. American banks followed suit. At the same time, the CIA poured millions of dollars into Chile to fund opposition groups, anti-government newspapers, and radio stations. They financed crippling strikes by powerful unions, like doctors and, most importantly, truck drivers. The truckers' strikes, starting in 1972, were designed to bring the country to a standstill. With no way to transport goods to cities, shortages of food and basic supplies became severe. Long lines for bread became a daily symbol of the growing frustration. The U.S. also backed far-right paramilitary groups like the fascist Patria y Libertad, Fatherland and Freedom. These groups launched a campaign of terrorism, bombing bridges and power lines, and starting violent street fights with government supporters. Their goal was to create a climate of total chaos and fear. The strategy was simple: create so much economic and social pain that the Chilean people would turn on their own government, and the military would feel it had no choice but to step in and restore order. The United States was manufacturing the very crisis it would later use as an excuse to destroy Chile's democracy. For 3 years, Allende's government held on, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. By 1973, the stage was set for the final bloody act. By early September 1973, Santiago was a city holding its breath. The economy was in shambles, and the political divide felt like a canyon. Allende knew a coup was coming. Declassified U.S. documents show that Nixon was being briefed on the high probability of a military takeover. A brief from September 8th noted, Navy men plotting to overthrow the government now claim Army and Air Force support. The man at the center of the conspiracy was General Augusto Pinochet. Just weeks earlier, Allende, trying to stabilize his government, had made Pinochet the commander-in-chief of the army. Pinochet had built a reputation as a loyal, professional soldier who followed the Constitution. He even personally assured Allende of his loyalty. It was a fatal mistake. In the early hours of September 11th, the betrayal was complete, and the Chilean Navy seized the port of Valparaiso, and troops began moving across the country. In Santiago, tanks rolled down the streets, surrounding the presidential palace, La Moneda. The coup leaders gave Allende an ultimatum: resign and surrender. He refused. From inside the palace, with gunfire echoing outside, Allende delivered one last, defiant speech to the Chilean people over a loyalist radio station. His voice, steady and resolved, became his immortal testament. "I will not resign," he said. "Placed in a historic transition, I will pay with my life for the loyalty of the people." Sooner rather than later, the great avenues will open again, and free men will walk through them to build a better society. Long live Chile! Long live the people! Long live the workers! Shortly after 11 a.m., the jets attacked. British-made Hawker hunters screamed across the sky, firing rockets straight into the heart of Chile's government. The image of La Moneda, a symbol of Chilean democracy for over a century burning and wrapped in smoke, was broadcast around the world. For hours, Allende and a small band of supporters held out. Around 2 p.m., soldiers stormed the palace. They found Salvador Allende dead. The military junta claimed it was a suicide. For years, many insisted he was murdered by the troops. But what was never in doubt was his choice to die rather than surrender the presidency the people had given him. That afternoon, a military junta of the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and police appeared on television. At the center of the group, arms crossed and face hidden behind dark sunglasses, was General Augusto Pinochet. The monster had been unleashed. The crackdown was instant and brutal. The junta declared martial law, dissolved parliament, censored the press, and outlawed all left-wing parties. A curfew was imposed across the nation. In the days and weeks that followed, Chile descended into a nightmare of state-sponsored terror. Santiago's National Stadium, a place of sport, became a massive concentration camp. Thousands of suspected leftists, students, artists, union leaders were rounded up and herded inside. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, at least 10,000 people were imprisoned there. One of the prisoners in the stadium was the beloved folk singer and activist, Victor Jara. His songs were the anthems of Allende's movement. To his captors, he was a symbol they needed to break. They smashed his hands with their rifle butts, taunting him to play his guitar now. Days later, his body was found dumped on a street, riddled with over 40 bullets. This was just the start. Pinochet formalized the terror with a new secret police force, the DINA. Operating outside the law, the DINA became Pinochet's Gestapo, carrying out the regime's worst atrocities. It ran a network of secret torture centers, including places with innocent-sounding names like Villa Grimaldi and Londres 38. At Villa Grimaldi, an old colonial house, an estimated 4,500 prisoners were held. Almost all were tortured. The methods were systematic and sadistic. One of the most common was la parrilla, or the grill. Naked prisoners were strapped to a metal bed frame while torturers applied electric shocks to their genitals, nipples, and open wounds. Survivors recall being forced to listen to the screams of their relatives being tortured on a bunk bed above or below them. Waterboarding was common. Victims were hung upside down and plunged into vats of filthy water, sometimes filled with excrement, until they nearly drowned. Sexual violence was a deliberate tool of terror. Women were systematically raped, sometimes by trained dogs. In some cases, family members were forced to watch. The regime also perfected the art of forced disappearance. Thousands of people were arrested by DINA agents, taken to secret detention centers, and were never seen again. They became los desaparecidos, the disappeared. Many were executed and buried in unmarked graves or dropped from helicopters into the Pacific Ocean. This created a special kind of agony for their families, and leaving them in a permanent state of not knowing, unable to mourn, forever searching for a truth the regime was determined to bury. And the reaction from the Western governments that helped pave the way for this? Quiet approval and open support. The same United States that had choked Allende's government financially immediately opened the floodgates of credit for Pinochet. U.S. banks offered millions in loans. The monster they helped create was now being fed by them. Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship lasted 17 years. In that time, he didn't just terrorize his people. He completely remade the country. Pinochet handed control of the economy to a group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago by the free market guru Milton Friedman. They were known as the Chicago Boys. They used Chile as a laboratory for a radical experiment in neoliberal economics. Hundreds of state-owned companies were privatized. Many sold for pennies on the dollar to friends of the regime. Social spending on health, education, and housing was gutted. The pension system was privatized. This shock therapy was praised by its supporters as the miracle of Chile. But the miracle had a staggering human cost. A new class of the super-rich emerged, but inequality skyrocketed. By the end of the dictatorship in 1990, nearly 70% of the population lived in poverty. The economic model born from violence created one of the most unequal societies in the world. A legacy Chile is still fighting today. The dictatorship finally ended, not because of outside pressure, but from within. In 1988, feeling secure in his power, Pinochet held a simple yes or no vote on whether he should rule for another 8 years. The opposition, given just 15 minutes of TV time each night, launched a brilliant and hopeful no campaign. They didn't just focus on the horrors of the regime. They painted a picture of a joyful, democratic future with the slogan, "Chile, joy is coming." On October 5, 1988, the no vote won. The people had spoken. Pinochet was forced to accept the result and call for elections. In 1990, democracy returned to Chile. But the monster didn't vanish. Jordi Pinochet had arranged a transition that protected him. He remained commander-in-chief of the army until 1998 and then made himself a senator for life, giving him immunity from prosecution. Justice seemed impossible until 1998. While traveling in London for medical treatment, Pinochet was arrested on an international warrant from a Spanish judge for crimes against humanity. Though he was eventually sent back to Chile and died in 2006 without ever being convicted, his arrest broke the spell of impunity. It opened the door for other military officials to be prosecuted and sent a message that even former heads of state are not above the law. More than 50 years after the coup, Chile is still a nation haunted by its past. The constitution written under Pinochet is largely still in place, a constant reminder of the dictatorship's long shadow. The economic model he forced on the country continues to fuel protests over deep, painful inequality. The story of September 11th, 1973, is a chilling lesson in how easily democracy can be killed when powerful foreign interests decide it's in their way. The declassified documents and survivor testimonies are undeniable. The United States played a key role in destabilizing a democratic government and propping up the monstrous regime that followed. This wasn't a game. It was a tragedy that led to the murder and disappearance of over 3,000 people and brought suffering to tens of thousands more. Remembering this history isn't about picking at old wounds. It's about understanding the horrific, real-world cost of foreign intervention and honoring the victims by never letting their stories be forgotten. It's a shared responsibility to make sure the great avenues of democracy that Salvador Allende spoke of in his final moments stay open for everyone. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into hidden history. Understanding these events is the first step toward making sure they are never repeated. Thank you for watching.